The next action that we can wire up is the add action. This action is not going to be quite as easy as the index action because now we're dealing with forms. And if you remember, we added a book form in the previous course module called book form, and that contained information that we're going to be passing back and forth from the browser into our action. And we also left the isPost request portion of this if block empty, and that's what we need to actually wire in next. One way that forms make things a little more difficult is a lot of times we're going to want to deal with validation. And we haven't really talked about validation yet. And so let's go ahead and talk about what we need to do to validate that our book form that's getting submitted is properly validated data. Zen provides some input filters that we can place on our book.php object that will do the validation for us. So what we need to do is open up our book.php object, and we need to have that class implement a Zen class called Input Filter Aware Interface. Part of the input filter stuff is going to require some use imports. So I'm just going to go ahead and add those here. One is already obvious. That's the class that we're implementing, or the interface that we're implementing. And then we're going to add some functions in here since we've just implemented an interface. The first two functions that we need to put in here are getArrayCopy and setInputFilter. These are just basic functions that we need to add so that we are complying with the Input Filter Aware Interface contract. Where things get interesting is how we implement the getInputFilter. So here's my implementation of the getInputFilter. And there's quite a lot that's going on here. Essentially what we have to do is create a filter or a validator for each attribute that we're trying to validate on our form. And so you can see here, as we create our input filter, we're checking the ID, saying that the ID is going to be required. We then check for the author, and we can pass in some validation on it, such as what's the minimum required length, what's the maximum required length, do we want to strip the empty strings and trim that kind of thing on our particular form inputs as they come in. And last, we want to add the title, which does the same thing. Since this input filter method's kind of an expensive initialization, we actually store that in a variable for our class as well. So I'm just going to push that back up here, and we'll set that as our protected input filter. So when we call getInputFilter, it only initializes that once, and then it can reuse that over and over for this book implementation. Okay, back to the book controller. So what we want to do, if we're going to be adding a new book, we're first going to instantiate the book object in our model area, and we're going to set the input filter. That input filter is going to get the one that we just created on that book object. Now obviously, you could have created a separate book input filter object that did the same thing, but since our book object didn't have much in it anyways, it was okay to put that in there, keep the class still at a reasonable size. The next section, we actually take the post information and set that data from our form. And here is how we check validation. So if the form is valid, we can go ahead and do something. Otherwise, we won't save this. At this point, we can call back to the book table gateway. We can use the exchange array to move the form data into the book data, and then ask the book table to save this book. The last thing that we'll do if we're saving a book is we're actually going to redirect back to our book list. Okay, so as we have implemented our add action, we have relied on our book class. And so we're going to go ahead and need to import and use that with the use statement up here and import our book. We can go ahead and test this out now and see how our add action is working in the browser. We'll go ahead and click on our add new book method. We'll just give it some test data. And it added our book. So you can see it's the last one in the list. We can also test our validator by seeing if it will take empty strings or bad data. In that case, you'll notice that a new book wasn't added because our validator is requiring those fields.